Okay, got to finish. Next 20 minutes, gonna do it. Audio 3, week 2. The French conquest of Indochina was not too much different than the British conquest of Burma in its basic aspects. I should back up and remind you that the French had been adversaries, of course, in the 18th century and into the first part of the 19th century, but in the middle of the 19th century, various developments, the rise of Germany and so on, led to the French slowly moving toward friendship with the British and vice versa. And eventually, of course, they were close allies in World War I. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 71 was a major element there. The German victory shifted the balance of power, set up Germany as the rising power in the world, gradually promoted British-French cooperation, and indeed the Dutch became more friendly to the British as time went on, partly for this reason. It's very complicated. I don't pretend to be an expert in European history, but these are obvious points. So the French, in the 1880s, decided that they needed an independent source of rubber and tin. And of course, when they decided to go into Indochina, they had superior weaponry and better administration. They managed to learn enough about North-South rivalries to exploit those, as well as learn about the Cambodian desire to avoid Vietnamese and Thai subjugation that had plagued them all those many centuries, and still does today, as a matter of fact. Something you can read about, and that we'll get into in the last part of the course. Slide 21. Now let's move over again to maritime Southeast Asia. This is not the best map, but it shows how evangelical Islam gradually penetrated, this took hundreds of years, the coastal areas of maritime Southeast Asia, but not the interiors. Preceding Islam was some element of evangelical Hinduism from India, but the base religion that was there, the basic religion, the earliest religion that was there was various forms of animism that was dominant throughout Indonesia, the Philippines, and Melanesia to its east, the South Pacific Islands, including present-day Timor-Leste, East Timor. So this influence of Islam, in other words, followed traditional trade routes and did not stray far from them, because that's where the people were. Now, animism and traditional superstition, I want to note, remain very important throughout this region, much more important than in the northern parts of East Asia. Ideas about the unseen remain very key, even amongst modern Indonesians and Malaysians. And these beliefs are about what is perceived to be real and important in life. Thailand has more of a dose of this sort of thing than Vietnam or China, certainly. Thailand's sort of in the middle between the superstitious beliefs, I would say, between Indonesia on the one hand and China and Japan and Korea on the other. But for example, in Thailand, changing your name in order to get better luck in life, magic, ghosts, evil spirits, these are things that exist with great influence in Thailand and with even greater influence in Indonesia. Of course, I'm not speaking in absolutes like everybody believes this or everybody believes that. I'm speaking in tendencies. And these beliefs, by the way, have nothing to do with Buddhism. They are they are old-fashioned, traditional, ancient animist beliefs. Going on to slide 22. The Dutch. Now, the Netherlands is a small country. What on earth were they doing colonizing a huge area of Asia? Well, they had displaced the Portuguese in trade, as we talked about before, and they had established these entrepôts all over Indonesia especially. And the British had had a series of conflicts with the Dutch and treaties in the 18th century, and in the early 19th century they established treaties, the two countries did, that defined their spheres of influence in Africa and in Asia. These two treaties were in 1814 and 1824. The last one was in 1824, was especially important because it focused on defining the British power in the region versus Dutch spheres of influence in a very precise way. The British walked away from the deal with peninsular Malaysia and with Singapore, which had been settled in 1819 by Sir Stanford Raffles. And by the way, if you ever go to Singapore, go to the Raffles Hotel and have a cup of coffee. That's probably all you'll be able to afford, unless you've got a big bankroller who can pay for your room. But the Raffles Hotel is a historical place and very beautiful. So to get back to what we were talking about, in 1819, the British had led by Sir Stanford Raffles, had settled Singapore. The Dutch were unhappy about this. Eventually, they had this treaty in 1824 that ceded control of everything to the south to the Netherlands and everything to the north, basically, to the British. And after this, the British and the Dutch gradually entered a cooperative phase in their relationship, which became warmer as German power arose after 1871. Imagine that. Not the least, the British wanted the Dutch and not the French in Indonesia. Although the latter two countries, the British and the French, were indeed moving closer, they weren't that close. And there was, I don't recall the exact nature of this, but right around this time in the mid-1880s, the British and the French nearly came to blows, for example, in Africa, as the French were expanding between the east and the west, and the British were expanding from the south, and they nearly came to armed skirmishes in certain areas right in the middle of the continent. So it wasn't all hearts and flowers, but there was a gradual melding of interests over the decades of the 19th century. Now, Yogyakarta is on the island of Java. It was, at the time, that is, the early 1800s, the strongest sultanate in the archipelago. But it was still coastal, as you can see on this blown-up map of Java. And Islam had completely penetrated the area because Java is a relatively small island. Bigger places like Borneo, the biggest island in Indonesia, was not so penetrated because of its mountainous, extensive interior. It's just a big place. But Islam was the strongest religious force, and because of that, it became the preferred religion of resistance, not only to the Dutch, but later on to the West themselves. However, the Dutch, having superior force of arms and having less resistance that existed on the mainland, pursued this step-by-step agreement, a series of agreements and military actions to hem in the sultanates, and indeed, it all worked out well for the Netherlands. So if you go to the next slide, 23, you'll see the end result. The British, Dutch, French spheres of influence, and there's the United States up there in the north, and the Philippines. And even little old Portugal had Timor-Leste, East Timor, had their spheres of influence through treaties. These were stable spheres of influence, allowing production to support economic and military growth, as we've already discussed. And the Netherlands, the French, and the British increasingly cooperated with each other on the world stage as the decades passed. The Dutch were able to partly control Indonesia, all the way from Aceh in the west to Timor-Leste in the east, using soldiers from different parts of Indonesia who were foreigners to the places that they were placed in order to maintain a distance from the local population. And this is a huge area from Timor-Leste in the east to Aceh in the west. It's the same distance as from Hawaii to Tokyo. This does not mean that the Dutch were supermen, but it meant that they were able to overcome fairly weak resistance, and it created conditions, the Dutch being far overstretched, that is, for Japan's easy conquest in World War II. In turn, Japan's overstretch all the way from Korea in northern Asia to Indonesia in the south led to their defeat in World War II, but we'll talk about that later. Slide 24. So this is the wider result. At the end of that period, a shift in dynamic had occurred. The US, UK, France, and the Netherlands were allies in World War I against the Germans and Japan, and at this point the Germans had a few colonies in Asia, particularly in, Qingdao beer. That's the city in northern China that the Germans held, and that's why they're, even in the dark days of Chairman Mao, there was good beer and good chocolate in Qingdao, but no place else in China. I digress. Even the Japanese joined the Allies on paper in World War I, while they were expanding in Northeast Asia in ways that began to cause heartburn with the British and the Americans, not moving beyond just taking over Korea, which we'll talk about in a couple weeks or next week, and leading after World War I to efforts by the British and the Americans in particular to rein in the Japanese, but again we'll talk about that later. The independent nations, or peoples, during this whole time were hard-pressed to resist this big happy family of imperialists. The peoples of Southeast Asia and others, such as the Koreans and the Indians, were simply not organized enough to resist because there were many divisions amongst them. These were the roots of nationalism, which we will examine in subsequent weeks. The roots of nationalism that led to struggles against colonialism that eventually overcame it, not only in this region, but worldwide. And indeed, during this period, another root of the nationalism that took hold was the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, which succeeded in 1918. Its stated ideals of resistance to imperialism and of national revolution and socialist economy were quite attractive during this period to certain people, indeed to many people. And the Russians made efforts to organize this resistance in service of their own foreign policy through the Comintern, or the Communist International, and they were quite successful, as we will explore in subsequent weeks. Going on to slide 25 to round this out. Australia at this time was not important in East Asian history, but the roots, or the seeds, I guess, of its present-day importance were being planted. As far back as 1606, there had been sightings by the Dutch of this gigantic place, which they called New Holland, but they didn't make much of an effort to settle it. The British did, however, as I've outlined on this slide, and they made their first circumnavigations of Australia and figured out that, oh my God, this place is so big. And then after 1790, when Australia replaced America as a destination for England's exiled convicts, the British developed small colonies in the southeast, and in Tasmania, which gradually were expanded, especially along the southern coast, which generally has a climate like that of southern and central Europe, without the snow. There isn't much snow that ever falls in Australia except for a few places. And then, when we get into the 1820s and 30s, Australia is no longer just a place where convicts are transported. It is now a place of choice, a destination of choice for people from Britain and later on Ireland. As the 19th century progressed, this is the way things developed. There were separate colonies in Australia, in New South Wales, in the far southeast, in Victoria, next door to it in the west, in South Australia, which is right in the middle there, where you see the bay, the great big bay in the southern part of the country. These were the first places, and Tasmania, the island in the southeast there. These were separate colonies because Australia was simply so big. And the British developed it, and it eventually only became a country with a central government that still had no foreign policy of its own, that was managed by the British in 1901. We'll talk more about why this is significant. In essence, nowadays you hear Australia called America's deputy sheriff in Asia, and Australia has a much more forward-leaning policy. It relies on the United States for part of its defense. At the same time, it tries to engage its neighbors, and China as an Asian nation, indeed, it has become a nation that's very relevant to modern East Asian history, but back then it was not, and this is largely because of, for demographic reasons, that is, Australia was so small in population during those days that it didn't really matter, and its distance was great from the rest of Asia, except for the southern part of Indonesia. So we'll continue next week in our broad overview of the 19th century and talk about Japan and why Japan was able to jump ahead and become an imperialist herself in only a few decades after the fall of their traditional government in the 1860s, in 1868. That's all for now. Have a great weekend.